A few days ago, I walked you through the Treasury Department's announcement that it would double its buyback operations on long-term government bonds, a direct intervention meant to support demand and push yields back down after they hit a 19-year high. This week, the market got its first real chance to answer whether that intervention actually worked. The Treasury held a fresh 20-year bond auction, $18 billion worth, and the results came back soft, weaker indirect demand than usual. A tail in the yield, dealers forced to absorb a larger share of the sale than they normally would. In plain terms, even after the government stepped in with a real, direct intervention specifically designed to support this part of the bond market, buyers still showed up more hesitant than the Treasury needed them to be. I want to walk you through exactly what happened at this auction, why the specific technical details matter far more than they sound, and why this result is a more honest signal about underlying demand than the reassuring headline from a few days ago. Here is the twist, and I am giving it to you immediately instead of making you wait. An announcement is not a test. An announcement is a promise about future action. And markets can react to a promise with genuine relief without that relief telling you anything about whether real buyers actually show up when the bonds are put in front of them. An auction is the test. It is the moment real money either commits to lending the government funds at the price offered or does not. This week's auction was the first real test since the buyback announcement, and the result, while not catastrophic, was genuinely soft, which tells you something the announcement itself on its own never could. Before I go further, I want to know who is with me right now. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and tell me honestly whether you had heard about this week's auction results, or whether you only heard the more reassuring headline about the buyback announcement a few days earlier. I read these, and I promise you the pattern in the comments under a video like this always reveals how much more attention a reassuring announcement gets compared to the quieter, more technical result that actually tests it. Let me explain what actually happened at this auction, because the specific details are more revealing than a single word like weak conveys on its own. The Treasury sold $18 billion of 20-year bonds at a high yield of 5.204%. The auction tailed by half a basis point, meaning the final yield came in slightly higher than where the market had priced it just before the auction closed, a signal that the Treasury had to offer slightly better terms than expected to get the deal done. The bid to cover ratio, a measure of how many dollars of demand showed up for every dollar of bonds actually offered, came in at 2.53 times, below the recent 6 auction average. And indirect demand, the category that includes foreign central banks and other large institutional buyers historically seen as a sign of broad, healthy appetite for U.S. debt, came in softer than usual, forcing primary dealers, the group of banks required to backstop any shortfall, to absorb a larger share of the sale than they normally would. None of these individual numbers on their own describes a failed auction in the most extreme technical sense, where there simply are not enough bidders at any price. But taken together, they describe an auction that needed real support to clear, arriving just days after the government announced a major new tool specifically intended to prevent exactly this kind of outcome. If you are finding this useful already, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because the next part explains why this specific combination, an intervention followed almost immediately by a soft real-world test of that same intervention, deserves more attention than either event would deserve entirely on its own. Here is why this matters. When a government intervenes to support a market, and the very next real test of that market still comes back soft, it suggests the underlying pressure driving the original problem has not actually eased, only that a new tool has been added to help manage it going forward. That is a meaningfully different picture than the reassuring version of the story, where an announcement alone is treated as though it resolved the underlying issue. The Treasury's own buyback program is specifically designed to provide ongoing liquidity support, precisely because auctions like this one continue to show real, persistent softness in demand, not because that softness has already been fixed. Understanding that distinction matters enormously for how you read every future headline about this exact situation, because the tool exists precisely because the underlying problem it addresses has not gone away. Let me make this real with two people, because none of this matters until you see how it lands in an actual life. Neither is real, but both are the kind of person you might recognize. The first I will call Bertram, 71, who read the reassuring headline about the Treasury's buyback announcement a few days ago and mentally filed the entire situation as handled, assuming the intervention itself meant the underlying pressure on long-term yields had been resolved. He did not see this week's quieter auction result and would have no reason to update his understanding, even if he had, since a headline describing a bid to cover ratio and a half basis point. Tale does not carry the same easily digestible clarity as a headline announcing a big, decisive intervention. The second person I will call Genevieve, 69, and she made a point of checking this week's actual auction results specifically because she understood that an announcement and a real-world test are two different things. When she saw the softer than average demand, the tail, the larger dealer allocation, she understood that the underlying pressure the buyback program was designed to address had not actually disappeared, simply that a new tool now exists to help manage it going forward. Bertram felt reassured by an announcement. Genevieve checked whether the actual market backed that reassurance up and found a more complicated picture underneath it. The difference between them was never how much either one had saved. It was that one of them stopped at the announcement and one of them checked whether the real-world test that followed actually confirmed it. Now, why do so many careful, engaged people end up like Bertram, treating an announcement as the resolution rather than the opening move? There is a simple reason. An announcement is designed by its very nature to convey resolution, confident language, a clear headline, a sense that officials have addressed the problem. A subsequent auction result full of technical terms like bid to cover ratios and basis point tails simply does not carry that same emotionally resolved framing, even when it is genuinely the more important piece of evidence. The investors who track situations like this one most clearly are rarely the ones with access to better information. They are the ones who have built the habit of checking the quieter, more technical follow-up evidence rather than stopping at the more emotionally satisfying announcement that preceded it. This is not the only soft auction result this particular stretch has produced either. Earlier in August, a separate 10-year note auction was described by analysts as soft, with a tail of roughly 1 basis point, itself following a string of auctions earlier this year that showed a similar pattern: weaker foreign demand, larger dealer allocations, yields settling higher than the market had priced going in. A single soft auction can reasonably be dismissed as an isolated event. A pattern of them stretching across multiple months and multiple different maturities is a different kind of evidence entirely, the kind that explains why the Treasury felt it necessary to reach for a tool as significant as doubling its own buyback operations in the first place, rather than simply waiting for demand to recover on its own. Now, let me be careful and honest with you, because I will not insult you with fear. And this exact subject draws people who want to frighten or excite you into a rushed decision. This week's auction was soft, not catastrophic, and a bid to cover ratio of 2.53, while below recent averages, is a meaningfully different situation than an auction that genuinely fails to attract sufficient bidders. At any price, it remains entirely possible that continued buyback support gradually stabilizes demand over the coming weeks and months. And one auction, even a soft one, does not confirm a permanent trend on its own. Anyone telling you this single result guarantees a specific crisis is overselling you a certainty that the data itself does not support. What I am giving you is not a prediction of crisis. It is the actual result of the first real test of an intervention that received far more reassuring coverage than the quieter, more technical evidence that followed it just days later. I want to say a word about gold and silver here too, because this exact pattern, real-world demand for government debt running softer than officials, would like even after direct intervention, is precisely the kind of underlying pressure that has continued supporting both metals through this entire stretch. Silver's own move to $68.20 earlier this week, and gold's break above $4,600 did not happen in spite of stories like this week's auction. They happened, at least in part, because of exactly this kind of quiet evidence continuing to accumulate underneath the more reassuring headlines. So let us pull this together and go back to where we started. Days after the Treasury announced it would double its buyback operations to support long-term bond demand. The first real test of that intervention arrived in the form of an $18 billion 20-year bond auction. And the result came back soft. A half basis point tail, a below average bid to cover ratio, and weaker than usual indirect demand, forcing dealers to absorb more of the sale than usual. That result does not confirm a crisis, but it does confirm that the underlying pressure the buyback program was designed to address has not simply disappeared because of the announcement itself. And the difference between the people who understand the real picture and the people who stopped at the reassuring headline comes down to one habit: checking whether the real-world test that follows an announcement actually confirms it, rather than assuming the announcement alone resolved the story. Here is what I want you to carry away from this, stated as plainly as I know how. This is not a call to panic, and it is not a call to make any dramatic move today, because balance and clear thinking matter enormously, especially with retirement savings. It is a call to keep watching the quieter, more technical evidence that follows major announcements like this one, rather than assuming a reassuring headline is the end of the story. Whether this changes anything about your own plan depends entirely on your own circumstances, your own timeline, and your own comfort with the kind of ongoing uncertainty this exact situation continues to demonstrate. And I am not here to tell you the number. I am here to make sure you are watching the same evidence. The market itself is watching, not just the headline that came before it. Do not let anyone use this auction result to rush you into a costly decision today, because there will be people trying, and they get louder every time a technical result like this one gets attention. And do not dismiss it either. Telling yourself a Treasury bond auction could not possibly matter to your own retirement account, because you just watched exactly how directly this kind of evidence continues feeding into the same gold and silver prices sitting in accounts across the country. Those are two different mistakes, and the sensible path sits calmly between them. None of this is financial advice. Every figure I have referenced, the auction size, the yield, the tail, the bid to cover ratio, comes directly from this week's official Treasury auction results and public market reporting on them. So you can verify every word of it yourself rather than take mine. I open by telling you that the Treasury's own intervention just faced its first real test, and that the result was not fully reassuring. Now you understand exactly why an announcement designed to convey resolution, followed days later by a real auction that still showed softer than average demand, telling you the underlying pressure has not actually disappeared, only that a new tool now exists to help manage it going forward. So let me leave you with the question underneath all of it. When an announcement and the real-world test that follows it tell two different stories, which one do you think actually deserves to shape how you think about your own plan? The confident headline, or the quieter evidence that came just days after it?